is Marcus Silvis, and today we will be discussing systematic inequality, the black-white wealth gap. We will discuss the definition of wealth, why the wealth gap hasn't decreased in all of these years, and some potential solutions to reduce the wealth gap. In order to get a better understanding of what I mean by wealth, let's take a look at a couple of definitions. Income includes earnings from work, Social Security benefits, pension benefits, interest and dividends that households use to meet current spending needs. Wealth, or net income, is the total of a household's accumulated financial assets minus all debts. Assets include income, stocks, bonds, savings accounts, as well as non-financial assets, which includes primary residence or other real estate and vehicles. You will also see the terms median and mean in this presentation. Median is defined as the middle number in a sequence of numerical data, and mean is the average of a group of numbers. Although the white population is 76.6% and the black or African American population is 13.4%, according to the United States Census Bureau data, keep the definition of median and mean in mind. Here are some of the key factors in the cycle of wealth inequality that I will discuss in this presentation: employment discrimination, mortgage market discrimination, less educational resources, and less access to health care. Here are some of the key drivers in perpetuating the white and black American wealth gap. African Americans own approximately 1/10 of the wealth of white Americans. The black-white wealth gap has not recovered from the Great Recession. Black households have fewer and are in greater need of personal savings than their white counterparts. African Americans face systematic challenges in narrowing the wealth gap. African Americans have fewer assets and more costly debt than white Americans. Let's take a look at our first topic, employment discrimination. In an article by Gibson Davis and Parcheski titled "Children and the Elderly, Wealth Inequality Among America's Dependents," it states, although likely multiply determined, increasing wealth inequality in the United States can be attributed in large part to a shifting labor market and changes in household debt patterns. The growth in globalization and the pervasiveness of skill-based economy, coupled with the erosion of labor unions and the real value of the minimum wage, has resulted in stagnating wages for many in the bottom and the middle of the income distribution, but skyrocketing wages for those at the very top. In an article by Hank, Solomon, and Weller titled "Systematic Inequality: How America's Structural Racism Helped Create the Black-White Wealth Gap," they posted some data from the 2016 Washington Post analysis, which found that if incarcerated individuals were included in the official unemployment rate, the black male unemployment rate was spiked from 11%, where it was at the time the article was published, to 19%. By comparison, factoring in the white male incarcerated population into the white unemployment numbers would raise the rate by less than 1.5 percentage points. Black men, for example, are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men as a result of policies that either directly or indirectly promoted mass incarceration and overcriminalization in communities of color, meaning that they are more likely to experience barriers to employment as a result. The table you currently see shows the wealth inequality from 1989 to 2016 among all households by race. If you look at 2016 data here, you can see the median wealth of whites compared to black or African Americans and the ratio of black or African Americans to white median wealth. You can see it's 10%. This shows that African Americans have far less wealth than white Americans. Less wealth translates into fewer opportunities, lower income levels, and fewer chances to build wealth or pass accumulated wealth down to future generations. Speaking of less chances to build wealth, let's talk about mortgage market discrimination. Mortgage market discrimination over the years means that blacks were less likely to be homeowners than whites, which means that they will have less access to savings and tax benefits that came along with owning a home. In 1934, Congress passed the National Housing Act, which created the Federal Housing Administration to support mortgage lending. The Fair Housing Act adopted the Homeowners Loan Corporation rating system, known as redlining, which is the practice of rejecting or restricting access to loans and financial services based on the racial makeup of a neighborhood. This practice was solidified into policy by federal government and adopted by private banks, shaping the segregated character of modern U.S. neighborhoods by eliminating investment in communities of color. Redlining forced black families into higher rate loans, if they could get them in the first place, which required them to live in certain areas within a community, and in many instances, prevented them from acquiring a home at all. It wasn't until 1968, with the passing of the Fair Housing Act, where redlining was made illegal. Prior to the 2007 to 2009 Great Recession, the wealth gap existed as it does now. The Great Recession just widened the gap as it destroyed $15 trillion in national wealth, which affected the economically vulnerable individuals. Think Progress released an article in July of 2018 discussing the result of a study which found that the Black or African American home buyers were more likely to be presented options in neighborhoods with higher concentrations of toxic contamination and pollution than their white counterparts. This study shows that there is housing discrimination by real estate agents to pollution exposures across the country. Take a look at this graph here. This is Zillow's analysis of the 2013 data from the federal government, which annually collects information from the mortgage lenders to identify possible discriminatory lending practices and to ensure that housing needs of all communities are being met. As you can see, mortgage denial rates were 27.6% for blacks and 10.4% for whites. With limited wealth and resources black Americans have, especially after the Great Recession, if a black American wanted to continue their education, they would more likely than not have to get a student loan. Now, if you can recall the definition of wealth, which is assets minus debts, if household assets stay the same, but the debts increase, and in this case, with the rising college cost, then it's not good for your household debt. Now, when a black American graduates, there's no guarantee that they will get a great paying job to pay off their debts. If you look at this table here, which is the inflated adjusted median wealth in 2016 by race and marital status, you can see that even if a black or African American were to obtain a college degree or more, they would still make less than a white American with no college degree. Now let's take a look at the disparity in health care resources. In an article by Gaskin, Heaton, Jr., and White Means, titled Racial Disparities in Health and Wealth, the Effects of Slavery and Past Discrimination, it is stated that racial disparities in health and wealth are well documented. Compared to whites, African Americans have low life expectancy and higher death rates from chronic diseases like coronary disease, breast cancer, and diabetes. In addition, African Americans are more likely to receive suboptimal care. African Americans were 3 times more likely to live in poverty than non-Hispanic whites. The median household income of African Americans were 62% of non-Hispanic whites. The net worth of African American households were 14.4% of non-Hispanic white households. In an article by Pollock et al. In 2013, it states that racial disparities and the prevalence of chronic diseases, functional limitations, mortality rates, and self-rated general health status are well documented. They find that the largest persistent racial disparities in health are for 4 health and functional status dimensions: alcohol dependency but healthy, mental health problems, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and smoking, and asthma. African Americans with mental health, diabetes, and hypertension have significantly lower health status. Let's recap and hit some important points here. Wealth, an individual's or family's financial net worth, can function as a generational stepping stone that older generations pass on and future generations benefit from and build over time. Throughout most of American history, however, this essential stepping stone was not, for all intents and purposes, available to African Americans. For blacks, the American experience began with slavery, which allowed whites to profit off of the bodies and blood of enslaved people, who by rule of law were unable to live freely, let alone build wealth to pass along to future generations. More than 1.5 centuries since slavery's abolition, America has yet to fully reckon with how to atone for this original sin. The disparities that exist between blacks and whites today can be traced back to public policies, both implicit and explicit, from slavery to Jim Crow, from redlining to school segregation, and from mass incarceration to environmental racism. Policies have consistently impeded or inhibited African Americans from having access to opportunities to realize the American dream. Direct action must be taken to change an American system built on suppression, oppression, and the concentration of power and wealth. The purpose of this presentation was to discuss the definition of wealth, why the wealth gap hasn't decreased in all of these years, and some potential solutions to reduce the wealth gap. Here are some potential solutions to help break the cycle of wealth inequality. For employment discrimination, prison reform, en masse incarceration for black people, and have better rehabilitation programs so people can return to society with a skill that can be used in the workforce. Expand paid leave for women, especially black women who already have trouble getting jobs, especially jobs with benefits. For mortgage market discrimination, redesign asset, tax, and social policy. Low income housing tax credits, increase housing voucher funding for black people who are having trouble getting homes, and hold real estate agents accountable for environmental racism. As for education, improve college affordability, give access to loans that don't have as high of an interest rate, so give people a chance to pay their loans back in a reasonable amount of time. As for healthcare, increase access to healthcare. Other solutions include raising minimum wage and protecting Social Security. This table shows the state minimum wage in 2018, the change in low-wage workers' annual purchasing power compared to $7.25 in July 2009, and the additional annual purchasing power under $15 federal minimum wage in 2024. The wealth gap can be addressed by electing politicians on a local and national level who are willing to revise policies that hinder African Americans and other lower income citizens. Growing up, I used to hear, if black people worked just as hard, then they wouldn't be where they are now. I hope this presentation provides clarity to the black-white wealth gap and to those who believe statements such as that. I also hope that people who hashtag All Lives Matter will assist in narrowing the wealth gap so we can proudly hashtag All Lives Equally Matter. Once again, my name is Marcus Silvis. Thank you.